to their clients very specifically. And what we know, if we've thought about this for any length of time or have the opportunity to pull together some of those different information sources, that almost inevitably you're talking about some of the same kids and families. And the most important thing to know about those kids is not their sort of agency involvement in record over time, but the fact that they have a family and neighborhood context, which is super important. Like, that's what they're doing. And the only way you get at that is to begin to pull together some of this information. So we hope by doing that, that we're closing some of the gaps that kids are otherwise falling into. You can take this to an extreme. So this is a map that our buddies in South Carolina shared with Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, which is, we'll say more about it in a moment. They're granted that does a lot of work in this space. But you know, once you've got a few sources of information from child welfare and education pulled together, why not get everything from medical to juvenile justice to the adult correction system? You can sort of advance the number of questions you are able to answer as you build trust among your agencies that are able to pull that together. I will say that South Carolina is more than a bit of an outlier here. And that's especially was true 10 years ago. So this is a map of when this group, Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, with whom Amy at the End of the Table Networks got started back in 2008 with some money from MacArthur. It was sort of a coalition of the willing. And these are either states or in some cases counties or cities that had figured out how to do this independently, I think in almost every case, as best they could. And so they pulled together a peer network over the course of the next several years. There was some natural organic growth to that group as they found fellows and built a national network. And then over the last 3 years, with some support from Casey and a ton of work, they've been trying to do some direct technical assistance to see, based on everything we've learned, to think about how to do this effectively in government and the kind of challenge this is. Could we really speed up that rate of interconnection between agencies, and you get to something that looks like this today, where you got, and this is a fairly, I think, conservative estimate because it's based on the specific work that this one group, AISB, does. And there's some other models that are a little bit similar that are also trying to do very important integrated work in places like Texas, which is going to add a whole lot of people, right? So this is a map for what the landscape for data integration looks like today. And I'm curious, for those of you who heard the term integrated data system, how many of you are getting any information from those IDS by show of hands? We have a few of the crowd, 1 to 2, 3, 4. That is better than I expected, but a lot fewer hands than the number of you who've heard of integrated data systems. And I think that that's not uncommon, and that's the missed opportunity. There are real reasons for this. One of them is the kind of challenge this is, as we've learned from Amy and her peers, is not really technological for the most part. It's not that we don't know how to build a database or a data visualization. It's that convincing agencies to play with one another is like convincing dogs that don't like each other that they ought to bunk together. It's just, there's a challenge related to building the right structures of governance and MOUs, negotiating legal agreements that have to be put in place before agencies are willing to play ball. And so much of the work that's been done in building out that resources you just saw on the map has really been about the top half of this diamond, which is what John Fantuzzo at UPenn calls like fixing the information dysfunction of government, right? The ways in which that senior leadership at the top are demanding unreasonable information on a bad time scale from the practitioners, who at the same time would love to rely on some help from researchers, but researchers have their own priorities and are working on an entirely different time scale. And mostly they talk nasty about each other. It doesn't have to be a really illuminating partnership, with the exception of some of the hard work that you folks do in here. But even as all of this integrated data work, I think, has begun to bring kind of cohesion and a bit of harmony to the top part of that pyramid, there is this chunk down at the bottom, which is the public and community stakeholders. And nominally, that is the sort of focus, is to get better information into the hands of advocates and local decision makers and civil society, and to make better decisions on their behalf. And that oftentimes does not happen. So what I wanted to turn to today was to get a few organizations together that have maybe thought about this and thought about the kinds of indicators, the kinds of public information we might be able to get, not from the census, which is out there, but from just administrative data now that we've got it linked. And so I want to introduce what I'm calling your alchemists for the day, because of the people who transform administrative data into community indicators. First, Regan Faust, who's Director of Strategic Partnerships, is that your title? At the Children's Data Network, CDN, down at USC in Southern California. So you're loving the snow. We've also got Sharon Kandris, who's the Associate Director at the Polis Center in Indianapolis, and Amy Hawn Nelson, who I honestly didn't know. Yeah, I was going to put a little hat on you. Is both serving as somebody who's done a lot of this technical assistance through AISP at UPenn, but also today is really presenting on the work for the specific integrated data system that she helped develop and lead in Charlotte here at UNC Urban Institute. So I'm going to turn it over to you three, and in addition to just presenting, I think, some interesting examples of what this can look like, what we might be doing more of in this room, maybe we can talk afterwards about how other folks can sort of raise their voices and begin to do some of the same. So let me start out with you, Regan, if you don't mind.
Just review when it's time for me to be done. Hi everyone, Regan Faust, Director of Strategic Partnerships. I also am a research scientist at the Children's Data Network at USC. And we do a lot of awesome integrated data work. I'll speak to that way later in the presentation. But I'm actually here to discuss the California Strong Start Index. It's one of our most simple, straightforward projects, but it also has the most resonance with the lay population, but also I think with this group, because as Chris mentioned, it's information that can be easily gleaned by information already available and collected at a state level. So a little bit about the Children's Data Network. The Children's Data Network is a data and research collaborative that specializes in the linkage and analysis of administrative records, and specifically to inform children's programs and policies. So you could think of our work as a large-scale, longitudinal birth cohort project. So starting from birth and the records that are collected about children at that time, looking forward and somewhat opportunistically dropping in information that exists about those same children and families over time. So arranging this chronologically is also, it's very intuitive, but it's also very helpful in having us understand health, well-being, public service interactions, and ultimately outcomes for every child who's born in a state in a given time period. It's also very specific to those children and families, valid and highly efficient because no new data has to be collected. Before I came to the Children's Data Network, I was actually in the funder space, and working with this data, I don't think I realized how awesome birth records are. They're universally collected, not just in California, but across the United States and internationally as well. It provides a population base for prospective analysis, so looking forward. It's the first data that's collected about individuals and families, so this is really the start to life. These are all standardized fields with documentation, historical, which is awesome for a researcher like me. It provides a decent amount of information that can be harvested. And it's information not just about the infant, but also about the infant's mother and second parent or father. So when you thoughtfully assemble, and visualize that information, you can actually tell a lot about the conditions into which children are being born, and also which communities in which you might need to support in order for all children to grow up on a more equal footing. So that brings me to the California Strong Start Index. So that's interesting. So the idea for this index really came out of a conversation we had with First Five Association in California and the Heisman-Simons Foundation, among our other funders. We had gathered to discuss the challenges that you and the funding sphere and advocacy sphere face when trying to assess the service needs of populations of children 0 to 5, right? Much of the decisions, or much of the information used to make those decisions is costly to collect, sometimes duplicative, especially for community needs assessments. Survey-based, county-level estimates are often what's used for good and bad. Data is often focused on adults and then extrapolated down to that 0 to 5 population. And that information is collected and then split up into discrete, like unidimensional variables. For example, you would find out information about income level, but not the income level of this person and also their low birth weight status, right? That combination is actually more helpful to understanding the conditions into which children are born and are operating than just that unidimensional variable. And often it's deficit focus, so focus on poverty, for example. So with all of our work on birth records, it made us wonder, okay, could information from birth records, thoughtfully assembled and simply scored, be used to help communities more efficiently and equitably allocate resources? And after some exploration, we concluded that the answer was yes. So you can see that some of the opportunities that we were really trying to capture here in creating a birth record indicator focused project. So in partnership with those partners, First Five Association, Heisman-Simons Foundation, and others, we created an index that's super simple. We literally created and identified 12 indicators available on the birth record that are shown to be related to good outcomes along the life course for children. We counted up those assets present on individuals' birth records, 0 to 12, and actually there weren't any that had 0, so I was happy about that, for each individual born. And essentially, this represents the constellation of resources around children at the time of birth. We aggregated those up to the census tract level, and then we mapped those scores across California. And so you can see some screenshots here, but you can also explore the index on your own at strongstartindex.org. And it is, again, essentially summarizes those conditions into which children are born. And then when visualized as a map and the disparities between communities are made apparent, it allows policymakers to really target resources where they're needed most. So this is awesome for those working on behalf of young children and families because unlike other indices, the data is very specific to the population of interest, so First Five Association, right? The data is very local, but it can also be aggregated up to the statewide level and at other disaggregations as well. So because each individual's birth record is geocoded, we are able to aggregate in a number of jurisdictions. So state senate, federal legislative districts, all of those are opportunities for us to aggregate. And the data can be disaggregated by racial and ethnic and other socio-demographic indicators in order to assess disparities. Importantly though, and this is, I think, what Chris was excited about in pulling us into this integrated data session, is the data is at an individual level. So rather than combining indicators and beginning to understand what's happening at a community from the combination of those indicators at the community level, you can actually get a more holistic view of the constellation of resources for those children and families in a community, and then actually link those birth records to later outcomes down the line to check to see if these scores are related to better or worse outcomes for kids. So what we did was we took these birth records and scores. We then, through linkage, were able to connect those those records to child protection outcomes and death, and found a strong inverse relationship between strong start index scores at birth and those two obviously overtly negative outcomes. And no new data had to be collected. So communities are thinking about using this in a variety of ways. We've heard that communities are using them to enhance or replace their community needs assessments and strategic planning processes. We're hearing that they're also using this to identify resilient communities. So thinking about what communities might be faring better on some other indicators that are outside of the what would have been predicted by the strong start scores. Like what could be happening in those communities that could be buffering risk. So we're also hearing at the state level that they're using this to help estimate the number of slots that might be needed for home visiting programs, and what type of home visiting programs might be best suited for those children, and in what communities they should be placed. So, as I mentioned, the Strong Start Index is one of our more straightforward data linkage and analysis projects. It's very intuitive, but it also shows you the power of just keeping it simple, stupid, in informing what's actually happening at a very local level. I would love to talk more about some of the other projects that we have. You can visit our website at datanetwork.org. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I'm thankful for the opportunity to share the work that we've been doing with you all. The POLIS Center, we're an applied research center at IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. And our mission is to help to partner to define, measure, and actively improve community health, well-being, and resiliency. And our strengths are in community and place-based research, information technology, and analysis. And today I'm going to share with you one of our partnerships to help inform policy, advocacy, and decision-making around domestic violence in Indianapolis. Just a little bit of background. The Domestic Violence Network, which I'll refer to as DVN because it's shorter, is a nonprofit organization in Indianapolis that has a mission to change the culture that leads to domestic violence through using advocacy, education, and collaboration with the community at large. In 2013, the Domestic Violence Network was really struggling to get a good handle on domestic violence in Indianapolis. It's really hard to get a measure, even at a national scale. If you look at statistics, it'll say something like somewhere between 600,000 and 6 million people have experienced domestic violence. So even there, it's a challenge. So our focus was really trying to figure out, or their focus was really figure out, just first of all, how many people are experiencing it, how many people are victims, how many are perpetrators. And that was a real struggle. They had some data from 211 calls, they had some data from the prosecutor's office, but really they didn't have a way to get a full picture. And they had a sense that they had a partnership that was already that already existed with several players in town that were concerned about it. But they had a sense that there were a lot of data sources that could tell them more about victims and perpetrators, particularly through the legal system, but they were all kind of siloed. So they didn't really have a way to kind of bring all that together. And as I mentioned, they had several partners already working together, and they had received a grant from the Department of Justice, and they had a series of questions they wanted to answer. They wanted to know, for example, can we link all these siloed data sets and learn about individuals and get a better picture of domestic violence in Indianapolis? And if we can do that, what can we learn about those integrated data? So what we did, they came to the POLIS Center because they know we have a long history of integrating administrative data sets to create community level metrics to measure well-being and quality of life. So they came to us and we proposed to do a feasibility study. First, let's figure out, can we do this? Let's answer that question and start to explore what we can learn. We established MOUs with all those data providers, which was pretty easy because they already had those relationships in place, and we had the history of being able to manage data like that. And then we did this feasibility study back in 2013 and 14. And answer the question, yes, we can integrate it, and yes, we can learn a lot about domestic violence. So we continue to expand that research, and most recently this year just published a public-facing data dashboard, which we're really excited about, to start getting some of those data out to the public. So the first challenge we had to overcome was really bringing all these data sets together, matching people across them, and deduplicating them. So we started with several million records, trying to figure out which ones of those were related to domestic violence, which wasn't always clear in the database. We had to kind of mine for those indicators or for those clues. And then we had to match people across those, and every single data source tracks their demographics differently, so it became a little bit of a challenge. But as an example, like the domestic violence shelter, we just looked at their numbers. There were about 4,000 people. There were about 4,000 just victims only. In the prosecutor's data, about 4,000 people in these officer tracking sheets. If you added all those up, you get about 18,000 people, but really there's a lot of people that were duplicated. So once we went through our process, we narrowed it down. There's about 10,800 victims in this 1 year of data. So we actually analyzed data across about 7 years of data over the past several years. And so I want to share with you some of the indicators that have come out of that and talk about how some of the partners are using that information. Excuse me. So we developed this series of reports and continue to kind of refine the analysis and grow the analysis over time. But as I mentioned, we have this dashboard that we produced. And this was the first time, the partners were really excited because it was the first time we had really reliable data that could paint a picture about domestic violence in Marion County. We recognize it's only data in the legal system, so there's a lot of unreported cases that don't go through the legal system, but this is better than anything they'd ever had before. So there was about 10,800 victims and about 10,300 perpetrators that showed up in the dashboard. You can see. We also highlight some of the data about those victims and perpetrators. So the orange charts show the age, so the 50% of the perpetrators are aged 25 to 39, and 83% of those are males. We also have tons more demographics. I'm just giving you kind of an example of the kinds of data that we have. But they're able to use this data to write better grants, to increase awareness about the issues of domestic violence, use it for advocacy, and their general communication. On the dashboard across the top, we also have it so you can kind of filter the data. So you can filter by gender, by race, by age groups. Here, as an example, I've filtered by Latino, so any kind of victims or perpetrators that are flagged in the database as Latino would show up and kind of filters the data down and summarizes it for that. In Marion County, about 10% of our population is classified as Latino. So you can see the data, there's quite a few, fewer numbers, but you can look at the differences. So for example, the perpetrators by age, there's like 58 instead of 50% that fall within that age group. And then the male, the perpetrators are 89% male compared to the 83% male. So you can really start to dig into the data and look at the differences by the demographics. And of course, we also allow people to map those. This is by victim's home address. So the light colors there are about 2 victims per 1,000 people. The dark colors are between 14 and 21 victims per 1,000. And this is focused in on Indianapolis, kind of the center township area, the center of the community. We also dug into, in addition to integrating some of those, we dug into the individualized data to get a little bit deeper information. So for example, the 211 call data, we're able to explore that and look at like why people that called for help with domestic violence, what other kind of support they were looking for. So across the board, the majority of callers were looking for some temporary housing when they called 211. And then a distant second was legal support and individual support. But when you start to look in that by demographics, you can see that differs. So again, kind of looking at the Latino callers, their number one call, almost all the callers for domestic violence also needed individual support and also needed legal help and also needed housing. So you can see their needs differ. So the Domestic Violence Network can help advocate for those resources and better understand those demographic changes and how that information can be useful for their efforts in allocating resources. And we also were able to look at the number of victims that had more than one instance. So 26% of the incidences had more than one instance of domestic violence. So really understanding that it's important in that first intervention and the first point of contact with those individuals to really get the support to both the victims and perpetrators to help prevent those from continuing in the future. It was really interesting to look at some of the data through the prosecutor's office and the outcomes of those cases. So this is kind of the progression. So the first column on the left is looking at all the cases that were in this data that we analyzed, which is about 7 years of data. So about 38,000 cases. That about a third of those never even made it to getting a charge. They just didn't pursue it. So about 23 to 24,000 of those had a case, had a charge brought against the perpetrator. But only about less than half of those weren't dismissed. Over half of those, the witness wouldn't cooperate. There was lack of testimony, so the case just got dropped entirely. So of the original 38,000, less than a third actually went to court, but 96% of those that went to court were convicted. So this really helps the advocates understand, working with the legal system, really understand that progression and understand what things that might be done to be able to pursue those cases through the system. We also go look at those outcomes by race. So the darker, the bottom colors, those that were convicted. One above that is those that were dismissed, and then those above that were no charges. So if we look at, for example, 42% of cases with an Asian victim resulted in dismissal. So that's the highest, of that category. In looking at Latino victims, 40% of those cases don't even file charges. And when you look at white victims, 34% of those cases result in a conviction. So it really helps to underscore, number one, cultural differences in terms of who's willing, and maybe there's some differences in terms of how the victims may be willing or not to pursue the perpetrator, and how those that are involved in the outreach might need to be able to respond differently. We also looked at a targeted initiative called Baker One, which is actually modeled after Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. But that initiative is really to try to reduce deaths as a result, homicide as a result of domestic violence. So they were thinking, okay, let's not just look at like geographic hotspots, but let's look at people. So they developed a watch list, kind of a high-risk offenders list that focuses on those that have high rates of multiple instances of domestic violence on a single person. So what they found in Charlotte was that by the time they get to a homicide, there had actually been 9 or so reports of domestic violence on that one person. So if they had intervened early, they could have had a different outcome. So the goal was to try to reduce those homicides, look at high-risk offenders, and the police officers started collecting really detailed information about domestic violence victims. So if they show up on the scene and there's like any kind of evidence of domestic violence or any report from the victim of domestic violence, they record really detailed information. And some of that information is about lethality. Again, they're really concerned about trying to get these high-watch offenders, to the point where they're not, getting to the point where they're committing homicides. So they ask questions of the victim like, did they have a gun? Did they threaten your life? Did they strangle you? All those things, so we can really get a better picture of what's going on with these different cases. And then we also looked at the number of arrests of these offenders before they were designated as a high-risk offender and after. And so what we found was like the year before they were on the list, they averaged about 3 arrests. And so they get on this list. The police are really watching them closely. Any kind of offense, that they're actually out there trying to point them to resources. They're not out there to arrest them. They're trying to give them help. So they may give them resource cards that have counseling or parenting class information. And so we see then the year after they're on the list, that drops to about 1 arrest per individual, and then down to half 0.6 arrests per person after that. So this data really gave them information to see, hey, the program's working, and really evaluate that and think about ways in which they can continue that program. So we have had a lot of great success working with the partnership, being part of that, and that integrated data has really helped to reveal some things that weren't otherwise possible. We know there's some limitations. Again, we don't capture those that aren't in the legal system, but we just found out that the Domestic Violence Network got another grant, so we'll be continuing the work, and we're excited for the next 2 years. We're going to look at some additional data, kind of dig deeper into some of the programming, maybe look at 911 data or some other data sets that are outside the legal system to really kind of dig deeper into domestic violence. We're excited to continue to pursue this project.
Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good. All right, so I'm here to talk about another sunshiny topic. We're like, great panel, Chris. So I'm Amy Hawn Nelson. I'm with Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, as Chris told earlier. We focus on the use, development, and innovation around integrated data systems. We've been told we shouldn't use that term. I'm still using that term until I learn not to say that term. It's supposedly not a good term. All right, so I'm a little complicated. I used to be in Mecklenburg County. I still live in Mecklenburg County. I remain a community engaged researcher in that community. I work remotely for Penn. The work I'm presenting is actually the work I did in my former role as Director of Social Research for an Applied Research Institute, and as the Director of the Integrated Data System there. So it's work I'm very proud of, very passionate about, but I have to make sure everyone in here knows this is not only my work. The principal investigator for this work, her name is Ashley Williams Clark. She is a magician of all things. She also just had a baby, moved out of Charlotte, and started a new job in Detroit this week. So I am presenting on behalf of her. She also made this very fancy PowerPoint, so I'm going to do my best to do her work justice. So Charlotte, like many communities, has a housing crisis in general. We've done a lot of housing work around research. If any of you on screens want to Google mecklenburghousingdata.org, you'll find all kinds of stuff, including the work I'm talking about right now. It involves dashboards and